The topic of eating carbs usually sparks a debate in the health and fitness space, depending on which side you're in. Are they bad for you? Are they antithetical to health? Or are they good for you? As always, there are levels, and I'm gonna break it all down in this video. Right off the bat, here's a very important concept you need to understand. Not all carbs are created equal, much like not all calories are created equal. The problem with the majority of carbs that the average person consumes is it tends to be processed. For context, the average North American consumes a mind-blowing 500 to 600 grams of highly processed carbs every day, which is just metabolically devastating because processing takes out a lot of the satiety signals that our bodies naturally look for to tell us to stop eating. The second stomach phenomenon is a perfect example of this. You seemingly always have room for dessert, even if you're already stuffed from a meal. Same goes for liquid sugar because it doesn't activate your satiety mechanisms. Now, let's actually start with liquid calories because there's really no place for them in your daily diet if you want to be a healthy and happy human being. As an occasional treat, sure. And this also includes sugary alcoholic drinks and beer. They don't call it a beer belly for nothing. A 20-ounce bottle of Coke, for example, has a whopping 65 grams of sugar, which is about 16 teaspoons. For context, the human body contains around 5 liters of blood, but only 4 grams of glucose, which is less than a teaspoon, circulates in the blood of an average person. And a sophisticated control system is in place to maintain blood glucose constant. The human body runs a pretty tight shift. And you're basically throwing a wrench in that process by drinking a can of Coke. If you abuse this process and constantly eat the foods I'm about to mention, that's how you develop prediabetes. 1 in 2 American adults have it. That amount of sugar is going to hyperstimulate insulin, which is your storing hormone. It also damages leptin, which is the hormone that sends a signal to your body that you're full. Long story short, liquid calories messes up the communication between your brain and body. Now, let's talk about something that's commonly found in a lot of processed carbs like bread and pasta. I'm talking about gluten. A recent study published in the peer-reviewed journal BMC Biochemistry found that digested gluten could literally block the ability for leptin to bind to leptin receptors. It was a dose-dependent response as well, meaning the more gluten was present, the more leptin was blocked. In fact, the amount of gluten eaten in a typical meal of bread or pasta was found to reduce leptin binding by up to 50%. Again, leptin is one of the key hormones that sends a signal to your body that you're full. It's actually one of the big players when it comes to controlling body set weight, along with insulin. It's been called the obesity hormone or the fat hormone, but also the starvation hormone. Now, you might be wondering, how could the Italians eat so much bread and pasta and not lead the planet in obesity rates? This is a pretty big topic, but for starters, they use a different type of flour. The most common wheat plant in the US is called dwarf wheat. They don't use that in Italy. Europe also have vastly different rules when it comes to agriculture and using GMO products. Next, let's look at the next tier of processed carbs, because food companies have manufactured a completely new category of foods that barely scratches the mechanoreceptors in your gut. And I like to refer to them as frankenfoods. These frankenfoods easily enable us to consume hundreds, if not thousands of calories without signaling satiety. I'm talking about puff snacks like Cheetos, Doritos, Funyuns, Rice Puffs, Cocoa Puffs, and good old Lay's potato chips. I mean, their marketing brag is, betcha can't just have one, and they're right. Because all those foods induce a phenomenon called vanishing caloric density. You put it in your mouth, bite down on it for a couple of crunches, and then it seems to almost just melt into nothingness. And if something melts down that fast, your brain basically thinks there's no calories in it, and you can just keep eating it forever. And without getting any physical bulk from the food, there's very little reason for your brain to tell you to stop eating. This is why you could never just have one Dorito chip. You get a taste of this highly palatable food. Next thing you know, you're staring at the bottom of the bag. You just have to realize that the biggest companies out there have invested millions of dollars in food research on how to short-circuit our brains. The average consumer has little to no chance at saying no to this stuff. It's also a double whammy when it comes to your metabolic health because a lot of these frankenfoods also contain industrial seed oil like canola and soybean oil, which are highly inflammatory. If we look at other macronutrients like protein, it's a completely different story. For starters, protein, as well as fats, are essential macronutrients. At the same time, there are no essential carbs. And even though protein also triggers insulin, it also activates other hormonal switches that prevents overeating. For example, it also activates glucagon, which is the counter-regulatory hormone for insulin, which signals fat cells to be released and get burned for energy. It also activates peptide YY or PYY, which is one of the key satiety hormones found in your gut. If you eat bacon and eggs, for example, which is mostly fat and protein, it tends to keep you full and satiated way longer than if you're to eat toast with jam. You eat the latter and come mid-morning, you're probably reaching for a granola bar. When you're thinking about weight loss, you have to think about hormones first, because the calories on all foods can be exactly the same, but it can trigger completely different metabolic pathways in your body. And I'm not saying you should never eat carbs. Not all carbs are bad. There's been a lot of societies that have lived primarily on carbs. The Katavans in the Pacific are perfect examples of this. They eat a diet of root vegetables, coconut, fruit, vegetables, and fish, and they have undetectable levels of cardiovascular disease, stroke, and obesity. 69% of their calories come from carbs, 21% from fat, and 10% from protein. The Okinawans in Japan are another great example. Japan has the highest rate of centenarians per capita on the planet, even though they eat a lot of white rice. Asians have been perfecting eating white rice for centuries. They eat a lot of fermented and sprouted food, and they also eat a lot of probiotics, also known as resistant starch. Resistant starch are indigestible and passes through the small intestine to take up residence in the colon, and it acts as a fuel source for healthful bacteria in the gut. Examples of resistant starch are green bananas and cooked and cooled russet potatoes and white rice. The molecular composition of the latter two actually changes from carbs into resistant starch when eaten cold. You can also see another example of this effect in the glycemic index. When you eat white bread, insulin spikes way up. But if you ate beans, which is also mostly carbs, the glycemic response is a lot lower. Just make sure to pressure cook the beans to take out all the anti-nutrients. But most natural foods are like that. You don't see that huge blood sugar and insulin spike that you normally get from processed foods. It really only starts to go sideways when we start tampering with whole foods. The processing makes the poison. Basically, the more processing your food goes through, the worse it is for you. Also, it's not just about the food that you eat and the amount of processing that it goes through. It's also about the frequency that you eat them when it comes to optimizing hormones. So stop snacking all day. Focusing on those two things is important because it leads you away from just strictly counting calories. Because when you do that, you'll realize that some foods are more fattening than others. This is why I always like to say that not all calories are created equal. Cookies are more fattening than eggs. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to deduce that. But then you get the calorie counting zealots saying that low-calorie ice cream is basically the same as eating steak. All common sense goes out the window. They'll say that it's all about the calories. You just need to be on a calorie deficit. But plain and simple, if you look at scientific studies, simply counting calories and treating all calories equal does not work long term. It might work at the beginning, but the human body is an adaptation machine. Because it's not about the number of calories, it's what your body does with those calories. But if you just strictly cut calories, and this is still conventional wisdom today, and usually the first thing to go is fat because it's calorically dense, and this is when people get into highly processed, low-fat versions of foods, so you eat less calories, and therefore that should translate into body fat loss. But that's not what happens. Like, if you eat 500 calories less, your body could simply decide to burn 500 less calories to match that deficit, and that's your basal metabolic rate. And it's not just a matter of thermodynamics, because that assumes that your basal metabolic rate stays stable. That is, if your BMR is 2,000 calories a day today, you go on a 500 calorie deficit, and you're still gonna burn 2,000 calories 6 months from now? Yeah, that's bro science. If you look at any basic research on the human metabolism, your body will actually burn less calories as a survival mechanism, because your metabolism can actually go up or down by as much as 40%. So cutting 500 calories a day, which is a pretty common number, because it should translate to a pound of fat lost in a week, does not work long term. Because if you don't change the hormonal response in your body, different foods contain different hormonal instructions, your body will simply adapt and burn 500 calories less. And you won't lose body fat, and worse, you actually start to lose muscle if you do this. Again, it's not the total amount of calories. It's what your body does with those calories. And that depends on hormones. Any overfeeding study will prove that. Why? Because the entire human body runs on hormones. Those are the instructions that we give to our body, and it can either promote health or sickness. That is, for the context of this video, one of your main jobs is to keep insulin moderated because it's the hormone that controls your body weight. Carbs, especially refined carbs and sugar, just happens to be the most insulinogenic. At the same time, you want to eat foods that trigger your satiety hormones, because weight loss in its very essence isn't about counting calories, it's about controlling hunger. Timing also matters. The best time to consume carbs is after a workout, because that's when your muscle suitcases are open. The carbs you consume are used to replenish your depleted glycogen stores. Muscle pays for the dance. Generally speaking, the more muscle you have, the more carbs you can get away with. This is why muscle is your metabolic currency. In a perfect world, you want to keep your carb intake under 50 grams per meal so you don't have a robust insulin response. Carbs really only become problematic if it disrupts homeostasis. And that's really my main point for this video. Just remember that food is information, not just a mathematical equation. Calories matter, but hormones are more important.